aggregate here, and it's like 2.5 stars on average, and there's 700 reviews. So we don't even need to waste time reading those reviews. And you may be correct. That may be the right way to do it. But if you just see a handful of these and it's, oh, the food was great, but the service was terrible. Well, if I've got more time, but I really want good food, maybe I should go there anyway. I think it's funny that we have trained people for the fastest possible responses and expect people to look at the situation and immediately go, this person's guilty, or when the truth is probably not quite that. I'll save my personal impressions on the specifics of the case, but I worry not so much about the people who are advocating for the Me Too movement. I'm a fan in general, of the Me Too movement, or the hashtag and what it's done. Because as I said, I can empathize with the people who are experiencing frustration. We have had a society where victims of sexual assault have been placed in a position where they are incredibly uncomfortable and unlikely to ever come forward. And that sits there and it stews, and it stews, and it stews, and then it explodes, as we've seen. And the problem with that sort of explosion is that there's potentially a lot of collateral damage. And I'm not saying who is or isn't collateral damage, but I can empathize with that frustration. And for me, once upon a time, we knew from statistical analysis that false accusations of sexual assault were incredibly unlikely because there were so many more that happened that were never reported. And now we're building a system where there are likely to be more accusations, which just by default increases the number of false accusations or questionable areas.
Yeah. Also, when you add the variable of anonymity, a lot of these accusations are anonymous.
Yeah. And when we build a situation like that, the question is, are we doing good? We're making a world where more people can come forward? Yes. And there's going to be some bad that comes along with that. So I'm incredibly encouraged by the fact that people are speaking up, by they're saying enough is enough. And yet I recognize that this comes with negatives as well. And I think that my frustration right now is with the people who either don't want to recognize potential negatives, or the people who say, it doesn't matter if there's negatives, because we've suffered too long, we've taken too much, and now we're going to do this. And I can empathize with that frustration, and not to spin off into this, but the school shooting recently, immediately there were these people saying, oh, well, there were 17 school shootings in 2018. No, there weren't. Not by any reasonable standard is that an accurate fact. Snopes did an investigation. They came up with 7. I looked at their list of 7, and I think there's maybe 3 that qualify as what most people think of when you hear school shooting. Someone went into a school and opened fire. 1 is too many. Why would you ever have to feel the need to engage in hyperbole and exaggerate the facts when all you've done is you've provided ammunition to people like Ben Shapiro, I saw, to say, oh, the liberal left, they're lying about the statistics of shooting. And he's not completely wrong.
Yeah.
And we may see some of the same things in the Me Too movement, but I don't want to in any way, I want to do everything I can to empower victims to speak up and to change the world around them, and deal with the additional damage and confusion that comes along with it.
Yeah.
I don't not pretend I have an answer. But.
Yeah, well, and we totally agree there, but we have to balance that with what we're seeing on social media now and in journalism and in organs of often pseudo-journalism like BuzzFeed. I mean, so like there were so many tells in this article of bad faith, right? And again, this is not to close the door or not to judge the veracity of any specific accusation, but for instance, one of the things that was listed as a reason to inculpate Lawrence was that he had favorably retweeted this article by Claire Berlinski, right. the Warlock Hunt, right? Which I encourage you to read this article. This is a very serious article by a serious woman journalist who's a very fine writer, who I've invited to have on my podcast. We haven't scheduled that yet, but where she is just in a way that does not at all discount the gravity of real sexual harassment, to say nothing of real sexual assault. She worries out loud in as eloquent way as possible about this overreach and about what seemed to be at the time of her writing a kind of an attitude of moral panic around this issue. Lawrence, I retweeted that article, right? But I mean, dozens and dozens of smart people retweeted that article because it was so well written.
I didn't.
Yeah, and this is one piece of evidence, again, as to his criminality. And there were many other things in the BuzzFeed article that we could talk about that should alert you to the fact that this was a broader attack on not just Lawrence, but it was motivated by an attack on the atheist community. I mean, I didn't even notice this until someone pointed it out. I'm attacked by link in that article because they linked to this hatchet job that Glenn Greenwald once did on me, seeming to show that I'm a bigot against Muslims. There were ulterior motives that get weaponized here, and again, we're all now part of this information feeding frenzy on social media, and we have to be circumspect in the way we consume this kind of information, and that's not to discount the fact that where there's smoke, there's fire is often a good heuristic, right? It is often true, and that's why we so often rely on it. But if you want to go looking for smoke about me with respect to the variable of bigotry, right, racism, right, you put in my name and racist, you'll find all the people who mistook my criticism of the doctrine of Islam for racism, right? And for all I know, there are 20,000 blogs that have made that claim about me. So,
hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's show. Tonight, I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Stephen Law, a distinguished English professor and director of philosophy at the University of Oxford, with a wealth of experience in higher education and a notable role as the editor of the philosophical journal Think. Dr. Law is going to give us insightful perspectives to our conversations. I got to add you real quick here. I'm sorry, give me 1 second, and you're going to be right here with us. How are you doing, Doctor?
I'm great. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course, of course. By the way, I want to say that looking you up, you look like a rock star. Anyone ever tell you with your haircut and your pictures, you look like you're about to pull up an electric guitar and play some solos for me, or no?
Yeah, I'm not a guitarist. I'm a drummer, actually.
Oh, okay. You play drums? Okay, I played bass for many years.
Yeah, in fact, look, I just realized I'm wearing Peisty cymbals.
Oh, is that some sort of drum company or something? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, Peisty cymbals are a very well-known cymbal brand.
Okay, I did not know that.
It so happens that I'm wearing the T-shirt. I hadn't quite.
Okay. So the look matches. The look message. How are you doing, by the way? How's your week been? Your day been good?
Good. Very, very busy indeed.
Busy is good though.
And in fact, I should admit, I got very confused about when this was going to take place.
Interesting. Okay.
Because I didn't read the email carefully enough. I thought it was going to happen at 5 p.m. GMT, which was hours and hours ago. So that would have been, some time ago. In fact, it's 1 o'clock in the morning now. So
I know it's late for you. So
yeah, and in fact, I went to sleep and then woke up to do this.
Well, I really appreciate that. Next time, if that's the case, we can always reschedule. Should be very flexible. If you ever realize that it's later, you can just let us know, and we'll do it another time.
It's my own stupidity and not paying attention to what you had clearly said in the email. So
that's all right. That's all right. It's fine. Felicia does our scheduling, and that's probably was a little miscommunication. But again, I thank you for coming on. Sure. One of the things that I found interesting, looking you up and reading some of your writing, is that in today's context, not a lot of people are doing like atheist conversation. That seems to be a bit like passé. Why do you still have these conversations and talk about this more specifically?
Well, I mean, when I got into philosophy, I wasn't at all interested in philosophy of religion to begin with. It was something that sort of I got into as I became exposed to humanism in the UK as kind of a movement, and I started doing some some work around that, and I ended up writing the Oxford University Press very short introduction to humanism. And I was also based at a college at the University of London called Heathrop College, which was a Jesuit foundation. And I was working with many Jesuit colleagues, most of whom I got on with extremely well, despite the fact that I'm an atheist.
Yeah.
And that meant that I was surrounded, by religion more than I might have been. And I think that's probably what resulted in me thinking about philosophy of religion more and more. Also, I'm generally interested in why people end up believing what certainly appear at first sight to be quite weird and strange and wacky things, from conspiracy theories to weird cults and so on. And so I'm kind of interested in religious belief from that perspective.
Okay.
Particularly interested in young Earth creationism, which is, of
Yes.
course, ubiquitous in the United States of America. I believe there are polls consistently showing that around about 45% of Americans sort of self-identify as young Earth creationists who believe
45? Really? It's 45% now?
Yeah, well, maybe it's less now. Maybe these polls were a few years ago, but yeah.
That feels like it's gone up to me, actually, from what I remember seeing American polls. That is really interesting.
Yeah, significant numbers. I mean, even if that's considerably out, it's still clear that enormous numbers of citizens of the United States of America believe that the entire universe is 60,000 years old. And, that's down to the power of religion. Religion has a quite extraordinary ability to get even smart, well-educated people, in some cases, to believe completely absurd things. And that's kind of disturbing.
It is. And that's one of the topics I think Felicia Senni that I was going to ask you about, is about the connection between a belief in God and modern day disinformation. Right, like, for example, something that's like right now trending on Twitter is that a lot of evangelical Christians and Trump fans are kind of into the conspiracy theory that the Super Bowl was hacked because they saw what's like Taylor Swift kissing her boyfriend who was the linebacker or something.
Right.
Is there a connection? Is there a conceptual theoretical connection between a belief in God and belief in other weird conspiracy theories, a way of pattern making that doesn't really line up with anything?
That's a very good question. I suppose, so there's a sort of empirical psychological question about whether people who sign up to religious belief, perhaps some of the more wacky religious beliefs, are going to be more likely to sign up to something like that, a conspiracy theory about Super Bowl being fixed, or and that's an empirical question, and I'm an armchair theorist as a philosopher.
I know, but so for me, the question
I'm not particularly well placed to answer it.
But the reason why I think that there might be connections in the way thought patterns. Like we can examine the way people argue for God or would argue for these other beliefs as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So what I can say as an armchair theorist, what I can recognise is that there are certain, exactly as you've just put it, certain sort of patterns of thought, ways of thinking in which you find similarities, similar mechanisms operating, similar ways in which people defend what they believe against what might seem to be overwhelming evidence against it, and so on. And there, I think that there are some interesting similarities. So a few years ago, I wrote a book called Believing Bullshit.
I like that title. Okay.
Yeah, how not to get sucked into an intellectual black hole. The idea being that, as you wander around our cultural landscape, you come across these belief systems that are gravitationally very powerful, very, very sucky. And if you get too close, you can end up being sucked in, never to escape. You become a kind of intellectual prisoner of the belief system.
Okay.
And what makes them intellectual black holes is that the beliefs are defended and propagated using certain kind of mechanisms, and I identify 8 in the book. And then in the book, I look at religious beliefs, but also various other, conspiracy theories and so on, and I show how these same mechanisms keep cropping up again and again. So
What are some of those mechanisms?
you are I think you're exactly right. That there is some overlap. So I don't say that these 8 mechanisms all crop up in every single one of these peculiar belief systems, but you find certain patterns tend to emerge again and again, and so some of them are a tendency to appeal to mystery as a kind of get out of jail free card. So there are mysterious beings, mysterious powers operating behind the scenes, be it the CIA or God or angels or demons and a lot of what might seem to be evidence against what you believe can be explained by appealing to these mysterious beings. Very often, the argument for believing in, something like the 9/11 disaster.
9/11 truthers,
Yeah.
okay, who believe the government did it?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
There's an appeal to puzzles to which we don't immediately have an answer, questions that can be fired off, like, well, exactly why did the buildings come down like that? Why does it look like a controlled demolition if that's not what it is? And a non-expert may be quite puzzled by these things and unable to offer an answer. But of course, once you've appealed to some mysterious being operating behind the scenes, it's easy to explain what otherwise might seem to be very puzzling. So the reason that it's like that is because it was a controlled demolition, and the reason that these things happen is because there were intelligence operatives operating behind the scenes, and so you can explain what otherwise might seem to be quite mysterious and hard to explain. And you find that that crops up in beliefs in things like gremlins. Why would you believe in gremlins or little mischievous beings? Well, I can't remember where I was sure I left my keys on the sofa, and now they're on the mantelpiece. How did that happen? How did the keys migrate from one place to another? I can't explain it. Can you explain it? No, neither of us can explain it. But if I invoke gremlins, mysterious little beings operating behind the scenes, suddenly what seems inexplicable suddenly becomes very
explainable.
Or if I can't explain why the flowers bloom in the spring, that's a mystery. Well, I just fairies immediately provide me with an explanation for what otherwise is really quite baffling, and to which I might not be able to provide a very convincing answer.
It's almost like I'm hearing. It's almost like a bait and switch using like a basic argument from ignorance, right? An argument from incredulity. I invoke a mystery, and I get the non-critical thinker to all of a sudden encounter this ignorance, and then I'll just implant this easy solution for them.
If you appealing to hidden beings operating behind the scenes will allow you to explain anything that you want to explain. And so you very often find that people who have religious beliefs will, if they're trying to recruit you, they're going to fire questions at you, mysteries. Can you explain why there's something rather than nothing? Can you explain how life first began on this planet? Can you explain all this, that, and the other thing? And by introducing some incredibly powerful and mysterious being operating behind the scenes, they can explain what otherwise we might struggle to explain. And so it might seem to them, and perhaps to the more gullible listener, that in fact they're making a really good case because they're offering what's sometimes called an argument to the best explanation. We should accept the best explanation available for certain phenomena, and I can't otherwise explain how my keys moved other than by appealing to gremlins, and I can't explain why the flowers grow other than by appealing to fairies, and I can't explain why there's something rather than nothing other than by appealing to God. So I better believe in all of these things because they're the best available explanation. So that's one of the common features that you find across religion, but also in conspiracy theories and other kinds of wacky beliefs in gremlins and so on. And then another feature is a tendency to explain away any evidence that might seem to threaten what you believe.
Okay.
So, young Earth creationists who believe the entire universe is 6,000 years old are often very intelligent people who have invested a lot of time and energy in cooking up explanations for what otherwise might seem to be very good evidence that the universe is actually a lot older than 6,000 years.
Yeah. So do they invoke these same mysteries, like, oh, how do we explain, I don't know, the reason scientists all agree on it, and then they try to give you some weird explanation about a cabal or something like that?
Yeah, they can do that. So there's that operating, but there's also a tendency to, if you go onto the website of Answers in Genesis, for example, which is
My favorite website, by the way.
one of the leading anything that you can think of in terms of evidence against their ludicrous theory, you'll find they've probably already thought of it and have already cooked up some kind of explanation for it. So the fossil record, for example, I mean, why do we see all of these sedimentary layers with creatures fossilized in them in exactly the sort of way that you would expect if we're a product of evolution by natural selection over a very long period of time? Not at all what you would expect if we were created 6,000 years ago, all species more or less created in the same form, all the kinds created, as they put it, by God, without any evolution whatsoever. So what they do then, when you point to this kind of evidence, is they cook up explanations. They start to explain away. They say, well, there was a biblical flood. This is the current young Earth creationist leading creation explanation. There was a flood that laid down enormous amounts of mud as a result of,
Okay, like a topsy-turvy and then
the
re-solidified
biblical
more.
flood, the one on which Noah famously floated his ark. It really happened.
Correct.
And that produced enormous mud deposits, which then buried the creatures that were being drowned. And that explains why there are these sedimentary layers building up. And it also explains why we find creatures buried in a particular order, because they're not all jumbled up. Because, of course, different ecological zones got buried at different times as the waters rose.
Okay, I see what
That
you're
begins to
saying.
explain the patterning that we find within the layers. And then the reason that you only find human beings in the topmost layers is because human beings are the most intelligent creatures that were able to survive until the very last moment. They were the last to drown, so they were the last to be buried, so they're only in the topmost layers, and so on. So you can start cooking up explanations like that, and young Earth creationists are really good at it. And you put those two things together: the appeal to mystery, firing off mysteries, put that alongside explaining evidence away, and you have an extremely potent mechanism for generating and retaining pretty wacky beliefs. I mean, the truth is that any belief with sufficient ingenuity can be defended come what may. I mean, if I believe that dogs are spies from the planet Venus, you might say, but Stephen, that's absurd because
That is absurd.
dogs, because you might say, oh, but obviously they're not because they can't even speak. And I say, but no, they can speak and they choose to keep their ability to speak secret. So they're very intelligent alien beings. Of course they can do that. More evidence against, well, you might say, well, how do the dogs communicate with Venus? We've looked in the dog's basket. There's no radio hidden in there, to which our Dave, who believes in this, says, no, the radios are hidden in their brains, in their heads.
Well, isn't that exactly why even really smart people can believe these things so dog? Because to be smart, to be creative, to be intelligent, you can construct so many different stories, so many different explanations to help you maintain your belief.
Explaining away can always be done to the point where you can make any belief system, no matter how ludicrous, you can square it with the available empirical evidence. You can achieve logical consistency with the available empirical evidence.
Well, here's a fun one. How do you know that you don't do this or that I don't do this?
We do it. I mean, that's the concern. I mean, sometimes it's okay explaining away is not always a mistake. If I believe that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade at 1 atmosphere, because I have pretty good evidence that that's true. If on one occasion I do the experiment and water doesn't appear to boil at 100 degrees centigrade at 1 atmosphere, I'm going to start explaining away. I'm going to say, oh, well, there must be something wrong with the thermometer.
Okay, yeah, we do all do that.
Or the temperature. the air pressure is not what I thought it was, or that the water is contaminated in some way, or you may not know what the explanation is, but you're convinced that there is one, and it's not unreasonable to take that view.
Mm-hmm.
Not explaining away if you have really good grounds for thinking that something is true, and for all you know, this is just an anomaly. It's when you start doing this habitually, it's when it becomes a pattern of thought where your first reaction is to start explaining away, no matter what evidence comes at you. That, in combination with the fact that you perhaps don't have very good evidence for thinking it's true in the first place. We do have good evidence for thinking more towards 100 degrees centigrade, but those two things in combination should lead you to think that maybe you got sucked into an intellectual black hole. Maybe you are a prisoner of a belief system. You think you're the one that's being rational and reasonable, but actually the patterns of thought that you're exhibiting, you find these across conspiracy theories, religious cults, and all sorts of other very wacky and weird beliefs. And so that's one of the things I do in the book, Believing Bullshit. I kind of identify some of these mechanisms, these patterns of thought that are exhibited not just by people who believe that 9/11 was an inside job, or who believe that homeopathy works, but also plenty of religious people. There is that common
common thread amongst all of them.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
A few days ago, you wrote an article on your blog spot, "Clarity in Philosophy and a Terrible Postmodern Argument Against It."
Yes.
And there's a line here where you're saying people say that if reality is vague and unclear, then we must be vague and unclear in talking about reality. Otherwise, we are not being true to reality. What is really your full analysis here, right? Because you're saying things like a picture can be simple, but it doesn't mean that it's fuzzy or vague. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I think it might connect to this: make reality fake, fuzzy, and then simplify it, and all of a sudden
Maybe
people
you're
buy
right.
it.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, well, the point I was making there was I had just read something. I think it was a tweet. Actually.
Yeah.
Somebody had defended sort of being unclear, particularly in philosophy, as being sometimes virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a common refrain from sort of analytic philosophers like myself that a lot of what's often called postmodern philosophy is extraordinarily opaque and hard to understand.
Okay.
It's clarity, and I, as a philosopher, really value clarity. It seems to me terrifically important that we be as clear as we possibly can be, so that other people can understand us, and so that if we're wrong, it'll be
clear, easy to understand. I mean, Kant was very clear, but also still very difficult to read in my experience.
Yeah. Now, sometimes things are just very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And there's no avoiding that. But we should always strive to be as clear as we possibly can be.
And this person was arguing that we ought to be vague, because if reality is vague
so there's a temptation that I've found quite a few people succumb to, which is to say that, oh no, hang on, but if reality itself is kind of unclear and vague and like a turnip portrait, swirly, and there's no detail and you can't really make things. If that's what reality is like, it's kind of like that, then our concepts and how we represent reality needs to be really unclear and vague and muddy in order to accurately represent reality. So there is an argument for being really clear, really unclear, really opaque, so that our representation of reality is true to reality, given that that's how reality is. That's a justification that you sometimes hear for being unclear, particularly when it comes to philosophy. And so I don't find this a very persuasive argument, obviously. And I think in the post I tried to just quickly knock that line of thought down by suggesting that what's going on here is people are confusing the attempt to clarify with the attempt to simplify or oversimplify. That is a bad thing. If you try and represent reality, which is very complex and subtle with a simple grid of pixels which are big and blocky and only come in 4 colors. Well, if you do that, you're going to lose an awful lot of information, and it's not going to be true to reality. You're going to need something which is much more sophisticated. You don't want to oversimplify. That's a mistake. But that's quite different from not being clear. It seems to me that it's desperately important that we be as clear as we possibly can be. And often these two things get muddled up. People assume that if nature is shifting and subtle and so on, then we need to be unclear in how we represent it, because otherwise we're not being true to reality. But the truth is that no, we should be as clear as we possibly can be. What we should aim to be what we should aim to do is to not oversimplify and present things as being clear cut and black and white, when in fact there are many shades of grey in between. You don't want to airbrush all of that out. So it's just a bad argument for not being clear, it seems to me, to muddle up oversimplifying.
Oversimplify as a way of maintaining your belief.
With being as clear as you possibly possibly
can.
That was the point that I was making. And maybe I think you're thinking that this somehow connects with...
A little bit. I kind of thought a little bit that it just a little bit connects, because when someone starts making things look vague, right? You're having a conversation with somebody, starts throwing these things, you don't know what they are. How can I explain this? And all of a sudden they give you a picture. They give you a simple map of why it makes sense. You're going to accept it, right? As opposed to, and that's what this person's arguing, that people do this and this way should be vague and analytical, but he's confusing clarification with simplification.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I thought it would connect, because I've been reading a lot more continental philosophy recently. I'm in the middle of reading Deleuze's work. I think it's Anti-Oedipus, and it's really confusing and difficult to read, in my opinion. And what I guess maybe this is a little tangential than other things we're going to talk about. I think it's interesting nonetheless. I think that he offers, or a lot of continental philosophers offer, much more of a perspective than an actual like detailed understanding of a thing or of a concept, or the interaction of a concept.
Yeah, and I don't, I'm not an expert on continental and postmodern philosophy, and I know that there's a great deal of philosophy that's extremely good that's done in that school, and I think that so I certainly don't want to sort of rubbish all of continental or postmodern philosophy, certainly not. But you do find that sometimes thinkers in that camp can be very, very opaque and very hard to understand what it is that they're getting at. And they'll tell you because it's really, really complicated and difficult, and you're clearly just not smart enough to get it. You're not sophisticated enough to think to really get your head around it. But that might be the reason.
You're just not clear. Yeah,
the other reason might be that they are actually just awfully unclear. And in fact, it's only when the philosopher John Searle once said, it's only when you try and explain something clearly that you realize whether or not you understand it yourself. And I think that very often, that's why it's a very worthwhile exercise, trying to be as clear as possible and to explain things as clearly as possible, because it's at that point that you begin to realize, oh no, actually I don't think I do fully understand how that works or what this point is. So clarity is valuable for that reason, and clarity, I've lost my thread now. So talking about the sorry, it's 1 o'clock in the morning.
I totally understand. I'm not going to hold you for too long. But this we were talking about being vague. We were talking about
So I was thinking about the work of so you remember that, I'm sure you're familiar with the so-called hoax.
The hoax, the grievance studies?
So-called hoax. The so-called hoax?
I don't know what that is.
Oh, okay. So there was a scientist who was very annoyed at the way in which he would find scientific theories being presented in the work of postmodern philosophers, often with very little understanding of what the theory was, making a complete hash of it. But nevertheless, these people were being taken terrifically seriously, and So what he did was he wrote a kind of a spoof paper, a postmodern paper, in which he cited lots of scientific theories, but he did so in a way that made no sense whatsoever to anyone that actually understood those theories.
Okay.
But
What
he
year was this? When was this? Do you know when this was?
Oh, we're decades ago. It's
Decades ago.
Sokal, Sokal.
Okay.
And he wrote a paper on something like the hermeneutics of quantum entanglement or something. I can't remember what it was.
Okay.
And he
Yes.
submitted it to a leading journal in the field, Social Text, I think it was called, and they published it. They were completely taken in by his bullshit. And and this was the kind of emperor's new clothes moment, many thought, for that style of philosophy, because suddenly everyone was laughing at them
Mhm.
with justification, because they'd been found out. They had been spouting this nonsensical gibberish as if it was profundity, and they'd published this paper, which was a complete spoof paper, not being able to identify that it was in fact scientific gibberish. I think Sokal then went on to publish a book with another guy called Brickmont called Intellectual Imposteurs, in
Okay.
which he sort of goes through the work of all sorts of continental postmodern thinkers, looking at the science that they appeal to, and it's very often sort of quantum stuff because it's so exciting, and they weave this stuff into their thinking in a completely nonsensical way. It doesn't make any sense at all, but people are taken in and think that they're terrifically sophisticated and clever thinkers. So that's a very funny book, Intellectual Imposteurs, and again, it's a kind of emperor's new clothes moment for those who who write that kind of gibberish.
I mean, a lot of
There's also
people.
the
Sorry.
famous
Go ahead.
postmodern essay generator, which you may have come across. Have you come across?
No, I have not come across that. I've never heard of
Go
this.
online and look up the postmodern essay generator, and
I will.
it
I will.
will
I'm gonna look it up right now.
spontaneously generate you personally, using various algorithms, your own postmodern essay. And it does it by just weaving the kind of words that they like to see in their essays together in a fairly random way, and generating fake references and so on. And it does look terrifically convincing. And in fact, sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between something that's been produced by the postmodern essay generator, which is literally gibberish,
Okay.
and something that
That's actually produced by
somebody's actually
a
written.
grad student or something.
Yeah, so there are these kind of emperor's new clothes moments that have been something of an embarrassment for thinkers in that camp. And I don't want to suggest that all postmodern philosophy is like that,
Of
but
course.
there's no doubt that some of it really is. Whether or not it's intentional is another question. I mean, are these people that are deliberately pulling the wool over the eyes of other people, or are they themselves bamboozled?
My intuitions is that it's not purposeful. I think that a lot of people who I myself studied psychology, and my concentration minor was in philosophy in my undergrad, and my transition to philosophy happened much later on. But I was really on my junior year. I was like, something, I have enough credits in this, I'll make it into a minor and kind of take a little more of a focus on it. And a lot of my initial stuff was science, hard sciences, biology, chemistry, physics. And when I got into humanities class, I saw that a lot of people just didn't understand science. They didn't understand the methodologies. They didn't understand how statistics prove that something is predictive or not predictive, and then they would not be able to apply that in their writing in the same way that students who had a science background. I think maybe that has to do a lot with it, is that you might not understand that same criterion for like what is a fact, what is not a fact, what statistics show, what statistics can show, and specifically what surveys show. Because I know in psych, surveys are used a lot, and surveys, not all surveys are created equal. Let's put it this way,
Right.
very not equal. So I don't think it's intentional. I mean, but you're a professor. You see a lot more of this. Do you think it's intentional? Do you think it's not intentional?
Well, I don't know. I can't really glimpse into the minds of these people. But what's true is that if you want to fake it, if you want to appear to be profound and have deep insights into the human condition and the nature of the universe, there are certain basic recipes that you can follow that will create the illusion. And in fact, in my book, which I should plug,
Yeah, everybody, go buy the book. Go buy the book right now. Everyone,
well,
buy
I've
the
got
book.
a whole chapter on pseudo profundity, appearance
Okay.
generating the illusion of profundity, and the recipes involve, for example, being unclear, um, contradicting yourself, and so on. So it's not difficult to abuse these kind of things.
Hmm.
Unclarity and contradicting yourself, for example, is a classic recipe. That if you contradict yourself in the right way, you can sound as if you're really saying something deep and meaningful. It is, but it isn't.
Oh, this is like I
And
think Daniel Dennett calls
then
it a
you refer
teaching.
to people often do that in religion. I mean, it's that when outsiders spot a contradiction in the Bible, they go, "Well, this is clearly not true because
Yeah,
it's
this
just."
makes no sense.
Whereas the faithful will go, "Oh, now we're really getting somewhere," because because that shows that God is, and yet He isn't. See, deep.
I see. It's
Uh,
almost like
we'll see.
you're not embracing the paradox, trying to change the way you think about the things. You're embracing the paradox as a way to substantiate what you already believe in.
Yeah. So if you want to be a self-styled guru and deliberately dupe people, it's not that difficult. There are certain basic recipes you can follow. So if you want to become a guru, you can read that chapter in my book.
So interesting. I think the audience would be interested in this. I think that uh, are these things that you see Jordan Peterson using? I'm sure you know who he is. I see him as a very like I personally see him as a very reformed, like weird Christian, where God is not even really God, but it's the narrative that's the God or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Maybe he's very unclear.
He is extremely unclear, right? I think
um,
people compare him to Deepak Chopra, but for like psychology. Um,
Yes, and I know that Richard Dawkins has recently suggested that it is just gibberish. This isn't deep and profound. This is just a load of old nonsense.
mhm.
Um, and maybe Richard Dawkins is correct about that. There is a whole again in my book, Believe in Bullshit. There's a whole chapter on called moving the semantic goalposts,
Okay.
in which I look at how religious people are often very good at dodging and weaving when it comes to dealing with criticisms, and suggesting that the reason that the critic's attack is misplaced because they haven't really understood what it is that they're criticizing. You're an unsophisticated and crude thinker that's failed to really understand what religion is really all about, and what religious people really mean when they say God exists. He's not a man on a cloud or an entity that exists in addition to the universe or alongside all of its contents. That's the wrong way. That's how you, a crude atheist, thinks about God. But we sophisticated religious people, we understand that God means something quite different to that, something ineffable, elusive. Um,
Yeah, but then when you push them and ask them if they believe that Moses actually got rocks in the mountain, they usually will dodge it.
yeah,
Like, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, the fact is that some religious claims, they're historical claims, and either it did
Yeah.
happen or it didn't. I mean, either Jesus rose from the dead or he didn't. Um, if we go back in a time machine, we're going to see one of those one of those two things. The tomb's empty or it's not. He comes out. And says,
Yeah,
"Yeah, I'm
of
back,"
course, of
or he
course.
doesn't. But you find that religious people will often they're really good at giving you the runaround because they constantly move the target. They say, "Well, this is what I mean," but then this is no, you've misunderstood. No, this is what I mean, and you find that you're being given the runaround. So a classic example of that, I suppose, would be evil seems. I mean, pain and suffering.
Hmm.
it seems on the face of it to be pretty good evidence against the existence of a supremely powerful and supremely benevolent and loving
Yeah.
creator. He might allow some evil if it's the price paid for greater goods, but he's not going to. He's not going to create a world in which we have millions of years of literally unimaginable quantities of animal pain and suffering before we human beings even show up. I mean, what on earth is that all about? What possible reason could there be for
I
all
mean,
of
when
that?
I was religious, I would just bite the bullet and say, "Yeah, God's also evil. He's not just good."
Well,
I
you
would
could
just
do
say
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's one option. That's a bit unorthodox. You what you'll find some people do is they say, "Oh well, you've misunderstood." You see, when we say that God is good, we mean something quite different from what we would mean if we described a pizza as being good or a human being as being good. God's goodness is of an ineffable variety, and God Himself is an ineffable thing. And you're taking aim at a sort of a crude caricature of what God is, but the truth is that what we mean by God is something transcendent and beyond our ability to
To even understand.
properly conceptualize it. And so
Yeah. Yeah. It's the same
you're
thing.
you're 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 missing the target. You're misunderstanding how religious language like "God is good" is being used. But then those same people later on, when the critic has left the room, will turn up saying that God is good and He deserves our worship and our gratitude. Well, now suddenly we're back with a very concrete notion of goodness,
Okay.
on which I think attitudes like worshipping this being. This is a being that deserves our worship, and we need to be grateful to it. Um, God is good in that sense. It turns out they do believe that. And now the question is, well, why do we deserve to be? Well, why should we be grateful to a God that tortures babies and unleashes untold horrors on us?
I,
For
I,
really no good reason. It doesn't. It make we're back to the problem again. So you find that when God is under attack, oh, he's terribly mysterious and he's placed behind a veil, and we can't really know anything about that. But then when the critics left the room, oh no, and now he's back, and he's definitely worth your worship and your gratitude and so on. So you'll be given the runaround.
it's almost like a type of code switching, really, where in front of one audience will speak in a certain way, and in front of another audience will speak in a different way.
Yes, I think that does happen actually. Yeah. And I think that the people that are doing it don't necessarily know that they're doing it.
Mm.
I think they think that they're being terrifically sophisticated and that their critics are being terrifically crude and oversimplifying. Whereas in truth, they are
Are
being,
being
uh,
incredibly vague, sophisticated while being vague, like
they're not being sophisticated, they're being elusive, and
elusive.
they're giving us the runaround. And that may fool them into thinking that they're being terrifically sophisticated, but in truth, they're really not.
They're really not.
And so the worry might be that Jordan Peterson's doing that a bit. You try and pin him down on whether did Jesus rise from the dead or not, and you can't. You're trying to. You're just constantly trying to pin him down and figure out what it is that he really thinks, and it's constantly running through your fingers. And is that deliberate on his part? Well, I have no idea. Perhaps not, but I think it may well be the same dance of the seven veils that's being engaged in there. And people,
For someone he speaks a lot against postmodernism, and this seems to be a very postmodern
oh, well, that's
tactic,
kind of ironic, then, isn't
right?
it?
That's kind of ironic.
Yeah.
I want to shift focus on something that I think that you wrote you wrote this, you edited this, you were the editor of this in 2008, Israel, Palestine, and Terror, right?
Oh gosh, yes.
Yes. And I found I was reading a little bit of the book, and I found your article on it about the idea of violent resistance being justified. Or the two authors wrote about that, and you specifically wrote about how nonviolent resistance can be successful. And there's this myth that
Yeah.
they have. Can we elaborate on a few things that I kind of just want to get your opinion, your thoughts on? October 7th. Do you think that it's fair to say that that is in any shape a justified resistance, even like with some of the people who wrote with you, like just your ideas right now?
Um. Well, I think that much of what occurred there is not justified violent resistance. That you're. So many people would argue that the Palestinians who are under an illegal occupation, and that's
Yes.
recognized internationally, they are under an illegal occupation, and it's a very long-standing one. If you're under an illegal occupation, you are permitted to resist violently. That's something you're entitled to do. And that doesn't mean, though, that you're entitled to murder civilians. I mean, the kind of resistance that you can engage in is in attacking military target, for example, or attacking military personnel who are oppressing you.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, well, what was going on October the 7th? To begin with, it looked like Hamas had committed some, beheading babies and baking babies in ovens and engaging in mass rape and so on. And a lot of those stories have since, even at the time, they looked a bit dubious, and some of them have been discredited by journalists in Israel.
Yes.
Haaretz, and they're saying this didn't happen. They made that up. It's not true. And so it's difficult to know exactly what did happen. But I have no doubt that some very bad things that were not justified happened, and Hamas engaged in war crimes, and no doubt about that whatsoever. So should they have done that? No, of course they should not have done that. They were not entitled to do that. Are Palestinians entitled violently to resist? Well, on the face of it, if they're under an illegal occupation, then yes, they are entitled violently to resist, despite the fact that actually those in the West Bank gave up on violent resistance a long time ago. I mean, they do not engage in violent resistance. They will not engage in violent resistance. And you might say, look what what's that got them?
Because
more and more of their land is being taken. They're being brutalized. Settlers continue to build and dismantle the Palestinian infrastructure,
especially some of Bibi's policies in East Jerusalem.
Yeah,
but one of the things that I a lot of times when I speak with, because I grew up in Israel, I was born in Israel, and then I moved to the States.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I found myself in the last 3-4 years before this happened, consistently speaking to people in Israel. You got to understand, like, occupation is bad. Like, we're being a part of the cycle. This is not the solution. Especially the right wing in Israel wants to go about this. And after October 7th, I found myself almost like having to take on a different perspective. I have to tell people, there are peaceful ways of achieving resistance. There are ways to do this. And what are some of the historical or examples in history where nonviolent resistance was successful? I mean, I know you brought up an example of a Christian village in Israel that did like they grew crops, and they refused to buy crops from Israeli farmers, and they refused to pay taxes and just wouldn't leave, and it ended up being they ended up winning what they wanted. Are there any other examples that you could think of?
Well, I mean, people always point to Gandhi,
and
the non-violent resistance that ultimately kicked the British out of India, and there are lots of other examples like that where non-violent violent resistance has proved to be very effective. But it's not always effective. I mean, when China invaded Tibet, the Tibetans did not violently resist, and they were brutalized, and they've not got anywhere with their non-violent resistance. So sometimes it works and sometimes it does not. It depends in part on the exact situation, the circumstances. Currently, I mean, the Palestinians in the West Bank do not violently resist, and in fact, that has been the policy, I believe.
Yeah, I think the PLO has been very demilitarized.
Yeah, whereas Hamas are committed to violent resistance. What's going to work in Israel? Which is the best policy? It's a very difficult question. And I don't pretend really to know the answer. And also remember, this is a book I published in 2008.
I know.
I can barely remember what I wrote. Insofar as you can achieve the outcome you want by non-violent means, that's what you should do. And but that's not to say that people aren't entitled to violently resist. I mean, maybe it's not the best policy, but that doesn't mean that they're not entitled to do it, to resist violently under international law. If you're under an illegal occupation, you are entitled to do that. Legally, you are entitled.
Yeah.
And I think that what happened on October the 7th was that there was an attempt to portray the attack as horrific, though it certainly was, and clearly terrible things happened, and that civilians were killed, and no one wanted to deny all of that. But it became exaggerated in a sort of almost pantomime-like way, so that Hamas and the Palestinians became almost less than human. These were animals. These were violent rapists who were mutilating pregnant women and cutting the babies out of their wombs and parading around with them. And these stories were then used to present Palestinians as being so beyond the pale that pretty much anything then could be justified.
Well, that's how dehumanizing behavior works, right? You take the person again, you turn them into a monster, you turn them into an animal, and all of a sudden everything is permissible. This is part and parcel of any government.
At the time, right? Immediately after the event, I was concerned that some of the more questionable stories that were being told about what Hamas had done were being used to portray Hamas and the Palestinian people in such a way that what's now happening could be made to look justified and reasonable. And so I think that even at the time, I felt like I ought to say something about that we need to be very careful about not just accepting everything that we're told, because we know that in war there is this thing called atrocity propaganda. There's a nice wiki page on it, actually. You can get lots of historical examples of how people cook up horrific stories in order to justify a violent response. You see that happening again and again and again. Is it happening here? Well, it would be very surprising if it didn't.
Of course it would. Of course it is. I mean, we know that the 40 beheaded baby story didn't happen.
Yeah.
We know that wasn't a thing, but we do know that some people were beheaded. We know babies were killed, but the 40 babies weren't beheaded. There was no 40 babies, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So we just need to be very careful and calm and not shoot from the hip and not just accept everything that we're told by Israel, in much the same ways we need to be very careful not to just accept everything we're told by the other side. I mean, there were claims made about attacks on one of the claims made about an attack on a hospital.
Yeah, that was the Ali hospital where Hamas rocket fell and killed.
People believed it. They shouldn't have been so quick to believe the claims that were being made. So you need to be careful on both sides,
of course.
But unfortunately, such is the atmosphere about this whole conflict that if you express that kind of reservation and let's just be careful, let's just not emotively hoover up all of this stuff and get really worked up about it and just uncritically accept it. Let's just be careful about these claims and let's check them out thoroughly before we buy into it. Even to say that, which I did say, got me accused of being a sort of terrorist sympathizer and anti-Semite.
What's funny about that? I get called sometimes a anti-Zionist, anti-Semite when I make comments from people on the right, and then I get called a Zionist, Arab, Islamophobe when I make comments about Hamas, for example. And I've said something similar, and I've gotten the same type of backlash for it that you've experienced.
There is. It's if you're a kind of I suppose the problem is this: that if you're a kind of left-leaning-ish sort of liberal kind of a guy, which I suppose I am,
I guess that happens.
You really worry, don't you? About you don't want to be a bigot.
No, of course not. Of course not.
You constantly searching your own soul and think, "Am I being a bigot? Maybe I am being a bigot." So if somebody points a finger at you and says you're a bigot, you're going to go, "Oh dear," and you're going to take some time to think about that and digest it and think it through. In the meantime, the damage has been done in terms of discrediting you and so the accusation of bigotry is particularly effective in these kinds of debate now. And you find it not just when it comes to something like Palestine and Israel, but when it comes to trans issues, for example, another very emotive topic.
Correct.
On social media. If you say something, you're almost certainly going to be accused of bigotry.
You want to know what statement that pisses off both sides when I say it every time? I say, Trans women are women, cis women are women, but trans women aren't cis women. That annoys everyone. Everyone hates when I say that.
I don't know why that would annoy anyone, but
Because now I'm saying that trans women are not like women, because I'm saying that
well, they're not
the
like
cis
yeah,
exactly, but they're also both. You can call them both women in this
yeah,
gender amorphous way. But it gets people angry because on one hand I'm calling trans women
yeah,
women, and on the other hand I'm saying they're not equal to women, and it just
yeah,
ends up annoying both sides because it's a little more nuanced. It's not as simple. It's not vague in
yeah.
a way.
So I think I think this is true, that there are people on both sides of that debate that are well intentioned and they are doing their best to be fair, and they want to respect the rights of others, feminists or trans activists or trans people that rightly feel, victimized and oppressed, and so I think the right attitude is to sort of listen carefully and understand where people are coming from. But you so rarely get that now. You just get this
You don't, yeah.
immediate knee-jerk accusation of bigotry from both sides, and that shuts down free speech. People become afraid to say anything, lest the finger be pointed at them, lest the witchfinder's finger start pointing at their chest, and that's sad and potentially, I think, quite dangerous when people feel they can't even say what they
Where do
believe.
you think this aversion to clarity comes from? Because I think the one theme that we keep hinting on tonight is aversion to clarity, a simple solution, right? Whether it be through conflict, it's two sides, one evil, one good. Whether it be trans issues, it's either you're a bigot or you're not a bigot. Whether it be an academia in religion, let me be vague so you'll believe me. What is this propensity, you think, causing us to want to be vague, to want to have these simple and not be clear? What do you think is causing this? Whether it be in discourse or what are your thoughts on that?
So I'm not entirely sure I understand that question. So in terms of simplicity and complexity and clarity, you're suggesting that all of these issues exhibit people not being sufficiently clear, and that's
Yeah, but not being clear, they're being simple because everything is vague. Like we talked about the current conflict with Hamas and Israel.
yeah,
Everything is vague at first. You don't know what to trust. You don't know what to trust. All of a
yeah.
sudden,
It's
clarity is not there, so simplicity sets in.
I would say, yeah, it's very complex. I'm not sure we want to use the word vague, but maybe I'm being a pedant. I don't know.
I
Um,
like it. I like it. Let's do that.
it's,
Let's do that.
it's clearly it's an extremely complicated issue, and we don't like complexity because we don't know what to do. We don't know what to think. It becomes very difficult for us. It's so much easier if you have a simple list of do's and don'ts, 10 commandments, whatever it happen to be. If things are just simplified, that's very attractive. So that's one reason why people tend to oversimplify and just make it, the people in the black hats versus the people in the white hats. Reduce it to a simple exchange like that between the goodies and the baddies. So that's certainly going on, and I suppose this use of the accusation of bigotry and witch hunting in order to point a finger at the people in the black hats, and say, "Oh, look how bad they are." Means that people no longer actually listen to the arguments or to what people are actually trying to say anymore. You're never going to make any real progress then, because you've kind of essentially prevented people from being heard. People will start self-censoring, and that's usually a pretty bad thing, and you're not going to make any progress. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse. You need people that are going to just try. These are emotive issues, and it's okay to feel strongly about them. I don't want to condemn people for having strong feelings, but at the same time, it's also important that we try and be calm and respectful and actually listen to what people are saying.
Well, what are you condemning then? If you're not condemning them for having strong opinions, what is it that you're condemning? What is the thing that's not stopping people from, as your book says, believing in bullshit?
What stops them from
Yeah, from
getting
not.
down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, from believing. Like, what doesn't stop them? What is it that you're condemning? What is it they're
Oh,
doing that is making them believe bullshit?
well, in terms of the believing, yeah, okay. Well, in the book, I kind of identify 8 mechanisms that are kind of warning signs.
Yeah.
You're sucked into an intellectual black hole. You become a kind of a victim of the belief system. You get too close. You're walking down the high street, and there's somebody with a leaflet, and a true believer with a glint in their eye, and they give you the leaflet, and it's trying to convince you that this is the way, or this is the truth, or this is the solution, or this political system will solve all of your problems, or whatever it might happen to be, and once you have passed over the event horizon, as it were, of this intellectual black hole, it becomes almost impossible to think your way out again. You find yourself getting deeper and deeper and more embedded in the belief system. And I don't want to necessarily blame people and say they're bad people, because smart, good people end up victims of these intellectual prisons. They get sucked in, never to escape. They're making... they're not exhibiting the epistemic virtues. They're not actually thinking reasonably. They're not actually constructing good arguments and responding to the evidence in the way that they should. But I don't want to say that they're bad people necessarily.
Of course not.
Often they're victims.
Okay. Yeah.
I know, and it's kind of sad that they've become victims of they're not particularly culpable. Sometimes they are culpable, but sometimes they're really not particularly culpable. So, have I answered your question? I'm not entirely sure.
Yes, you did. Well, I want to thank you. We've been around. It's been 55 minutes. We're at the end of our time.
Okay.
I had a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and everyone should go. First of all, where can everyone find you? Your Substack, your book. What do you give yourself your shout out?
Well, I suppose so. I've got various popular. I'm kind of known as a kind of a popularizer of philosophy. I've written all sorts of very serious papers, but I've written a children's philosophy book, which is also good for adults, called The Complete Philosophy Files.
Okay.
Which has got cartoons in it. So
I like cartoons.
If you like that kind of thing. I wrote a book called The Great Philosophers, which is kind of a dip in, dip out book, which gives you an introduction to a key philosophical idea from one of the great philosophers. I wrote The Philosophy Gym. That's probably the book I like the best. The Philosophy Gym, kind of a mental workout. So 25 Short Adventures in Thinking. That's a book that I wrote that I'm particularly happy with, from what's wrong with gay sex through to the universe comes from.
Okay, I like that. It's funny.
And but actually, using a lot of philosophy. I mean, it's undergraduate first year level philosophy mostly.
Well, that's good for a lot of people. I think a lot of people feel philosophy is inaccessible because it's usually.
There are those books, and then I've got a blog. Stephen with a PH. I'm a PH Stephen, not a V Stephen. StephenLaw.org. I blog on there, and then I'm working for Oxford University. I am directing philosophy at the Department of Continuing Education, which is a great thing. So you can take anyone anywhere in the world can take a course at Oxford University. And in fact, take the equivalent of a first-year undergraduate degree called the Certificate of Higher Education at Oxford University. And it just so happens I run that
Interesting.
at the Oxford University Department of Continuing Education. So you might want to check that out, because I'm there doing philosophy, teaching courses and so on. And what else, if I'm plugging myself, what else could I plug? I'm doing a lot of work for Oxford Literary Festival.
Okay. What's the literary festival? Just like a collection of books and the writers and stuff like that?
No, it's what I tend to set up are like debates and discussions on topics, questions like free speech and woke culture. We've got one on that.
Interesting.
Very interesting speakers. I set up a question time style event with some really great speakers. I've got an event on the uncanny. I don't know if you've heard of Danny.
Like the Uncanny Valley, or just the Uncanny?
No, uncanny, as in the spooky and weird.
Oh, okay, yes. I know.
Ghosts, and I've got some of the world's leading experts on that stuff. I've got a guy that's just got a book out actually called Into the Uncanny, and then I've got a professor of anomalistic psychology, Professor Chris French, who works on the uncanny. And then, so I've got events like that, which I'm putting on at Oxford Literary Festival, and I'm also putting on school festivals for some of the local schools.
That's incredible. That
So
really is incredible.
I'm pretty busy, which is why I was completely exhausted this
I
week.
see. I see. Well, you took a nap. I appreciate you coming in and having a conversation with me. And hopefully we can do this another time again on a different topic.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And
Of course.
yeah.